Chapter 1. The owl at dawn. Harry Potter had grown accustomed to waking before sunrise. Not by choice, the Dursleys had trained that habit into him years ago, but it had followed him to Hogwarts like a scar that wouldn't fade. This morning was different, though. This morning something was tapping at the dormitory window, with the persistence of a woodpecker and the urgency of a fire alarm. He sat up in his narrow bed, glasses sliding down his nose, and squinted through the pre-dawn gloom. November 1st, the day after Halloween, and his throat still felt raw from breathing in the smoke of jack-o'-lantern candles during last night's feast. Ron was snoring 2 beds over, his red hair splayed across his pillow like spilled paint. Dean and Seamus hadn't stirred. Neville was curled into a ball, clutching his pillow as though it might save him from whatever nightmare was currently visiting him. The tapping continued. Sharp, insistent, officially irritated. Harry slipped out of bed, bare feet silent against the stone floor, and padded to the window. The owl perched outside was not Hedwig. This bird was larger, darker, with intelligent amber eyes, and what appeared to be official seals tied to its leg. Not the usual Hogwarts post owl, and certainly not the sort of bird that delivered birthday cards or care packages from well-meaning relatives. This owl meant business. Harry unlatched the window, and the bird swept inside with business-like efficiency. It extended one talon, offering a thick envelope bearing the unmistakable seal of Gringotts Wizarding Bank. The wax was deep red, almost the colour of dried blood, and pressed into it was the image of a goblin's profile in rigid relief. "What?" Harry began, but the owl fixed him with such a withering stare that he simply took the envelope and watched as the bird turned and flew back into the darkness without ceremony. The envelope was heavier than it should have been. Much heavier. Harry turned it over in his hands, noting the formal script that spelled out his name. Mr. H.J. Potter, Gryffindor Tower, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Below that, in smaller text, urgent and confidential. Banking irregularities detected. Banking irregularities. Harry had never given much thought to his vault at Gringotts beyond the handful of times he'd visited to withdraw money for school supplies. He'd assumed, with the naive confidence of a 12-year-old, that someone responsible was managing his affairs. Someone trustworthy. He should have known better. He should have learned by now that assumptions about trustworthy adults were dangerous luxuries he couldn't afford. The envelope opened with a soft, tearing sound that seemed too loud in the sleeping dormitory. Inside was a leather-bound ledger, small enough to fit in his hands, but dense with pages, and a formal letter written in Goblin script with English translation below. Mr. Potter. Our investigation into vault access irregularities has uncovered information that requires your immediate attention. The enclosed ledger documents unauthorized transactions spanning 11 years. As the rightful account holder, you have the legal right to review these records. If you choose to pursue this matter, additional evidence is available upon request. Your servant in truth, Griplash Senior Account Security Investigator, Gringotts Wizarding Bank. Harry's hands trembled slightly as he opened the ledger to the first page. The entries were meticulously recorded in Goblin script with English translations, each one stamped with official bank seals. The dates began on November 1st, 1981, the day after his parents died. The first entry made his breath catch in his throat. Unauthorized withdrawal. 15,000 galleons. Authorization. Forged document bearing Albus Dumbledore's seal. Witness. Griplash. 3rd Spear. Query submitted to account holder. No response received. No response received. Because the account holder had been a 15-month-old child sleeping in a hospital bed, unaware that his parents were dead, unaware that someone was already helping himself to the Potter family fortune. Harry flipped through page after page, his horror mounting with each entry. November 15th, 1981. 8,000 galleons. December 3rd, 1981. 12,000 galleons. January 18th, 1982. 5,000 galleons. The withdrawals continued month after month, year after year, always authorized by documents bearing Dumbledore's signature, always witnessed by increasingly suspicious goblins whose queries went unanswered because the account holder was a child who didn't even know he had a vault. By his 4th birthday, Harry calculated numbly. Dumbledore had stolen over 47,000 galleons from his inheritance. But it wasn't just the money. As Harry read deeper into the ledger, his stomach twisted with each new violation. Family heirlooms, removed from the vault without authorization. His mother's jewelry collection, liquidated through Goblin auction houses. Ancient Potter family books, sold to private collectors. His father's Quidditch trophies from Hogwarts, gone. And then, on a page dated August 15th, 1985, Harry found an entry that made him feel physically sick. Monthly payment to Vernon and Petunia Dursley. Privet Drive, Little Whinging. 300 galleons. Purpose, guardianship services and accommodation expenses. Authorization, A. Dumbledore, Chief Warlock. Guardianship services. Dumbledore had been paying the Dursleys to keep him, paying them with Harry's own money. 300 galleons every month for 11 years, nearly 40,000 galleons total, to house him in a cupboard and call him a freak and make him cook breakfast with burns on his hands from the frying pan because he was too small to reach it properly. The Dursleys hadn't taken him in out of grudging family obligation. They'd been hired. They were employees, and their employer had been paying them with money stolen from their victim. Harry's hands were shaking so badly now that the ledger slipped from his fingers and fell to the floor with a soft thud that sounded like thunder in the quiet dormitory. Ron stirred and mumbled something about Quidditch practice, but didn't wake. Harry bent to retrieve the ledger, and as he did, a folded piece of parchment fell from between its pages. He unfolded it with trembling fingers and found himself looking at what appeared to be an official document. Last Will and Testament of James and Lily Potter. The first lines made Harry's vision blur. In the event of our deaths, we name Sirius Black as legal guardian of our son, Harry James Potter. Should Sirius be unable to serve in this capacity, guardianship shall pass to Frank and Alice Longbottom. Under no circumstances is Harry to be placed with Petunia Dursley or any member of her household. Under no circumstances. His parents had explicitly, legally forbidden the placement that Dumbledore had arranged. They'd known. Somehow, they'd known exactly what would happen to him in that house, and they'd taken steps to prevent it. Steps that someone had ignored. Harry sank onto his bed, still clutching his parents' will, and stared at the ledger lying open on the floor. The numbers swam before his eyes, but their meaning was crystal clear. Albus Dumbledore, the man everyone called the greatest wizard of the age, the man who'd defeated Grindelwald, the man who'd saved the wizarding world from Voldemort, had spent 11 years systematically stealing from an orphaned child and paying his abusers with the stolen money. The worst part, the part that made Harry's chest ache with something deeper than anger, was how perfectly orchestrated it all was. The noble story of the boy who lived, placed with his loving relatives for his own protection. The carefully maintained narrative of sacrifice and love. The grandfatherly concern, the twinkling eyes, the way Dumbledore always seemed to know exactly what was best for everyone. It was all a lie. All of it. Harry looked around the dormitory, at Ron still snoring peacefully, at Neville, who'd stopped clutching his pillow and was now sleeping quietly, at Dean and Seamus, who'd managed to sleep through an owl delivery and Harry's subsequent breakdown. They had no idea. None of them had any idea that their beloved headmaster was a thief. But Harry knew now. Harry had the proof, meticulously documented in Goblin script and sealed with official bank stamps. The question was what to do with it. He could confront Dumbledore privately, he supposed, demand an explanation, insist on restitution. Dumbledore would probably have excuses ready, something about the greater good, about protection, about necessary sacrifices. He'd make it sound reasonable, even noble. He was very good at that. Or Harry could take this ledger to Professor McGonagall, or to the Ministry, or to someone in authority who could hold Dumbledore accountable. But who? Who in the wizarding world had the power to challenge Albus Dumbledore? And more importantly, who would believe a 12-year-old boy with a history of getting into trouble? Harry closed the ledger carefully and tucked it into his trunk, beneath his school robes where no one would think to look. The will he folded and slipped into the pocket of his pajamas, close to his heart. Outside the window, the sun was beginning to rise, painting the lake in shades of gold and pink. Soon his dormmates would wake, and there would be breakfast in the great hall, and classes, and the ordinary rhythms of Hogwarts life. But nothing would ever be ordinary again. Nothing would ever be the same. Because Harry Potter, the boy who lived, the child everyone pitied and praised and protected, finally knew the truth. And truth, he was discovering, was a heavier burden than prophecy. Chapter 2. The Weight of Gold. Harry had never skipped breakfast at Hogwarts before, not once in the 2 months since term began. The Great Hall in the morning was one of his favourite places, warm and bright and full of the comfortable noise of hundreds of students starting their day. But this morning, the thought of sitting at the Gryffindor table, pretending everything was normal, while Dumbledore presided over the hall with his grandfatherly smile, made Harry's stomach turn. Instead, he found himself in an abandoned Transfiguration classroom on the 3rd floor, the Goblin ledger spread open before him on a dust-covered desk. Weak November sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across pages that documented 11 years of systematic theft. Harry had read through the entire ledger twice now, but the numbers hadn't changed. They never would. 47,329 galleons in direct withdrawals, 23,750 galleons worth of liquidated family heirlooms, 39,600 galleons in guardianship payments to the Dursleys, plus interest and fees that the Goblins had meticulously calculated, a total of 60,247 galleons stolen from the Potter estate. 60,000 galleons. Harry couldn't even properly imagine that much money. He'd thought himself rich when Hagrid had first shown him his vault, with its modest piles of gold gleaming in the torchlight. He'd had no idea that what he'd seen was just the dregs, what was left after 11 years of theft. The worst part wasn't even the money, though. As Harry turned to a page near the back of the ledger, he found himself looking at an itemized list of his mother's jewellery, each piece described in careful detail before its sale date. Lily Potter's emerald engagement ring, sold to private collector, 450 galleons. Lily Potter's pearl necklace, inherited from maternal grandmother, auction house sale, 230 galleons. Lily Potter's gold charm bracelet, sold to private collector, 180 galleons. His mother's engagement ring, the ring his father had given her, the ring she'd worn when they were married, when Harry was born. Dumbledore had sold it to some collector who probably had no idea what it meant, what it represented. It was sitting in someone else's jewellery box now, just another pretty bauble torn away from its history. Harry closed his eyes and tried to remember what he knew about his mother's jewellery. The answer was nothing. He knew nothing about it, because he'd never been told he had a right to know. The Dursleys certainly hadn't mentioned it. They'd spent years telling him his parents had died in a car crash, leaving him nothing but trouble. And Dumbledore. Harry's eyes snapped open as a memory surfaced, sharp and clear as broken glass. "Your parents left you nothing but their love, Harry," Dumbledore had said during Harry's first year, his blue eyes twinkling with what Harry had interpreted as kindness. "But that is worth more than all the gold in Gringotts." Love was worth more than gold. What a convenient philosophy for someone who'd been stealing the gold for over a decade. Harry thought back to other conversations, other moments that now felt poisoned with new understanding. Dumbledore's gentle discouragement whenever Harry asked about his parents' friends, his family history, anything beyond the basic story of their sacrifice. "The past can be a painful place to visit, my boy. Perhaps it's better to focus on the present." Translation. Don't ask questions that might lead you to discover what I've been hiding. And the Dursleys, Harry had always wondered why they'd taken him in at all, given their obvious hatred of anything magical. Now he knew. They hadn't taken him in out of family obligation or guilt or even grudging decency. They'd been paid. Handsomely. 300 galleons a month was probably more than Uncle Vernon made at his job some months. Harry could suddenly understand their behavior with crystal clarity. Their fear whenever Hogwarts letters arrived, not just fear of magic, but fear of their employer. The way Aunt Petunia sometimes looked at him, with something that might have been guilt before covering it with her usual disdain. The way they'd never quite managed to kill him, despite years of neglect and abuse that might have broken other children. They'd been careful with their investment, careful not to damage the property too badly. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside made Harry hastily close the ledger and stuff it into his school bag. A group of third-year Hufflepuffs passed by, laughing about something one of them had said, and Harry felt the strangest sensation, as though he were watching them through glass, separated from their easy happiness by knowledge they couldn't comprehend. When their voices faded, Harry pulled the ledger back out and turned to the final section, a summary prepared by the Goblin investigators. The language was formal, precise, damning. Subject: Albus Dumbledore, Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot. Charges: theft by deception, forgery of authorization documents, illegal liquidation of trust assets, conspiracy to defraud a minor. Recommended action: full restitution plus penalties, formal charges through Wizengamot. Additional notes: pattern suggests long-term strategy of control and manipulation. Subject appears to have positioned minor heir for maximum psychological dependency. Maximum psychological dependency. Harry stared at those words until they blurred together. That's what he'd been, wasn't it? Dependent. Grateful. The poor little orphan boy, so thankful for any scrap of attention or affection from the great Albus Dumbledore. So eager to please, so desperate to belong somewhere, so willing to accept whatever explanation was offered for why his life had been the way it was. The boy who lived, the child who'd defeated the Dark Lord through love and sacrifice and innocent magic. What a perfect story. What a perfect cover for systematically looting his inheritance and positioning him as a grateful little puppet. Harry could confront Dumbledore directly, of course. March into the headmaster's office and demand an explanation. But he could already imagine how that conversation would go. Dumbledore would be sorrowful, regretful. He'd explain how he'd only been trying to protect Harry, how the money had been used for Harry's own good, how everything had been done out of love and concern for Harry's welfare. He'd make it sound reasonable, even necessary, and then he'd make the evidence disappear. Harry had no doubt about that. Dumbledore was the chief warlock of the Wizengamot, one of the most powerful wizards alive. If Harry gave him warning, gave him time to prepare, the ledger would mysteriously vanish and the goblins would suddenly be unable to substantiate their claims. Harry would be left with nothing but accusations that would sound like the wild fantasies of an attention-seeking child. No. If Harry was going to do this, he had to do it in a way that left no room for manipulation or cover-ups. He had to do it publicly, dramatically, in front of witnesses who couldn't be silenced or bribed or made to forget. He had to stand up in the Great Hall and read Dumbledore's crimes aloud for everyone to hear. The thought made his stomach lurch with terror and determination in equal measure. Harry Potter had spent his entire life being quiet, being grateful, being the good little boy who didn't make trouble. Even at Hogwarts, even when he'd saved the Philosopher's Stone or fought the basilisk in the Chamber of Secrets, he'd done it quietly, privately, letting Dumbledore control the narrative afterward. But this time was different. This time, he had proof. This time, the truth was written in Goblin script and sealed with bank stamps that couldn't be argued away or explained into irrelevance. Harry closed the ledger again and held it against his chest, feeling its weight. Such a small thing to contain such enormous betrayal. In a few hours, the Great Hall would be full of students and teachers eating lunch, chattering about their classes, completely unaware that their beloved headmaster was a thief and a manipulator. But they would know soon enough. Harry would make sure of that. He thought about Ron and Hermione, about how they would react. Ron, who worshipped Dumbledore almost as much as he worshipped his older brothers. Hermione, who trusted authority figures with the blind faith of someone who'd never been failed by the adults in her life. They would be hurt, confused, probably angry at Harry for shattering their safe little world. But they deserved to know the truth. Everyone deserved to know the truth. Harry stood up, slinging his bag over his shoulder with the ledger safely tucked inside. He had classes to attend, homework to pretend to care about, a normal day to perform until the moment came to drop his bombshell. And when that moment came, probably at dinner tonight, when the entire school would be gathered, he would stand up and tell them all exactly what kind of man they'd been trusting with their lives and futures. His hands were steady now, his stomach settled. For the first time in 12 years, Harry Potter knew exactly what he was going to do, and why he was going to do it. It felt terrifying and liberating in equal measure. Outside the window, clouds were gathering over the lake, promising rain before evening. Harry watched them for a moment, then headed for the door. He had a performance to give, a normal day to get through, and then he had a truth to tell that would change everything. Chapter 3. Ghosts in the Corridor. Harry had always been good at pretending. 11 years with the Dursleys had taught him to hide bruises behind carefully arranged sleeves, to swallow hunger until it stopped gnawing at his stomach, to smile when Uncle Vernon introduced him to colleagues as our nephew. Bit slow, but we do our best with him. Those skills served him well now as he walked through the corridors of Hogwarts, the Goblin ledger weighing down his school bag like a stone. Transfiguration came first. Harry slipped into the classroom behind Ron and Hermione, taking his usual seat near the middle of the room. Professor McGonagall was already at the blackboard, her emerald robes crisp as always, writing out the day's lesson in her precise handwriting. "Today we'll be working on cross-species transfigurations," she announced, without looking up from the board. "A particularly challenging branch of magic that requires absolute focus and control. I expect your full attention." Harry opened his textbook and tried to focus on the diagrams of mice and snakes, but his mind kept drifting to the ledger. Did Professor McGonagall know? She'd been at Hogwarts when Harry's parents were students, had known them personally. Had she questioned Dumbledore's decision to place Harry with the Dursleys? Or had she simply trusted, as everyone seemed to trust, that Dumbledore knew best? "Mr. Potter!" McGonagall's sharp voice cut through his thoughts. "Perhaps you'd like to demonstrate the theory behind cross-species transfiguration." Harry looked up, realizing he'd been staring at his textbook without reading a word. Sorry, Professor. Could you repeat the question?" McGonagall's lips pursed in disapproval, but her expression softened slightly as she looked at him. Are you feeling well, Potter? You seem rather distracted today. I'm fine, Harry said quickly. Just tired. McGonagall studied him for a long moment, and Harry had the uncomfortable feeling she was seeing more than he wanted her to see. Perhaps you should visit Madame Pomfrey after class, though I suppose... She paused, glancing toward the door as if expecting someone to appear. Professor Dumbledore did mention he was keeping an eye on you this term, making sure you're adjusting well. He's always so concerned about your welfare. The words hit Harry like a physical blow. Professor Dumbledore always knows what's best for you. The same Professor Dumbledore who'd been stealing from him for 11 years, who'd paid the Dursleys to abuse him, who'd built an entire narrative around Harry's suffering to keep him grateful and dependent. Yes, Harry managed, his voice sounding strange even to his own ears. Professor Dumbledore is very thoughtful. McGonagall smiled, apparently pleased by this response. Indeed he is. I've never known a man more dedicated to the welfare of his students. Now, shall we continue with the lesson? Harry nodded and bent over his textbook, but the words swam before his eyes. McGonagall trusted Dumbledore completely. It was written in every line of her face when she spoke about him, in the way her voice warmed when she mentioned his name. She had no idea. None of them had any idea. The rest of Transfiguration passed in a blur of half-heard explanations and botched spell attempts. Harry's mouse grew scales but kept its whiskers, earning him a disappointed look from McGonagall and a concerned whisper from Hermione about whether he'd studied properly. Potions was worse. Professor Snape stalked between the cauldrons like a black-winged vulture, his eyes missing nothing as the second years attempted to brew a simple healing potion. Harry had always assumed Snape's hatred of him was purely personal, revenge against his father, resentment at Harry's fame, simple sadistic pleasure in tormenting someone who couldn't fight back. But now, watching Snape's face as he criticized Neville's technique with particular venom, Harry noticed something he'd missed before. When Snape's gaze fell on Harry, there was something else in those black eyes besides hatred. Something that might have been discomfort, guilt. Potter, Snape's voice cut across the dungeon like a blade. Your potion appears to be the wrong color entirely. Did you perhaps think that chartreuse was an acceptable substitute for gold? No, sir, Harry said quietly, stirring his cauldron with mechanical precision. I'll fix it. Snape leaned closer, close enough that Harry could smell the lingering scent of potion's ingredients on his robes. Your father, he said, in a low voice that wouldn't carry to the other students, always thought the rules didn't apply to him either. It was the same sort of comment Snape had made dozens of times before, but today Harry heard something different in it. There was the usual venom, yes, but underneath was that regret. And when Snape straightened up, just for a moment, his eyes darted toward the ceiling as if he could see through the stone to the headmaster's office above. Professor, Harry said impulsively, keeping his voice equally low. Did you know my parents well? Snape went very still. For a moment, his mask slipped completely, and Harry saw raw pain flash across his features. Your parents, Snape said finally, trusted people they shouldn't have trusted. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning Harry was only beginning to understand. Then Snape's mask snapped back into place, and he moved on to torment Seamus about his measurements, leaving Harry staring into his cauldron with new questions burning in his mind. Did Snape know? About the money? About the Dursleys? About Dumbledore's manipulation? Was that why he looked so uncomfortable whenever the headmaster was mentioned? Was his cruelty to Harry born not just of hatred for James Potter, but of guilt over his own silence? Lunch in the Great Hall was torture. Harry sat at the Gryffindor table, picking at his food, while Ron complained about Snape's impossible standards, and Hermione worried about their upcoming charms essay. The ledger pressed against his ribs where he'd tucked it into his robes, and every time he glanced toward the high table, he felt physically ill. Dumbledore sat in his carved chair, resplendent in robes of deep purple, chatting amiably with Professor Flitwick about something that made the tiny charms professor laugh. His eyes twinkled behind his half-moon spectacles as he buttered a roll, the very picture of a benevolent grandfather enjoying a meal with his family. It was all performance. Every bit of it was performance, and Harry was the only one in the entire hall who could see it for what it was. "Harry!" Hermione's voice seemed to come from very far away. "You're not eating anything." "Not hungry," Harry muttered, pushing his plate away. "You missed breakfast too," Ron pointed out, around a mouthful of shepherd's pie. "Are you sick?" "I'm fine." But he wasn't fine. He felt like he was drowning in secrets, like the knowledge in the ledger was a poison spreading through his veins. Every smile from his friends felt like a lie, every casual mention of Dumbledore's wisdom like a knife between his ribs. "Mr. Potter." Harry looked up to find nearly headless Nick floating beside the Gryffindor table, his pale form shimmering slightly in the afternoon light. The ghost's usual jovial expression was subdued, almost grave. "Sir Nick," Harry said, surprised. The house ghosts occasionally chatted with students, but they rarely sought anyone out specifically. "I wonder if I might have a word with you after lunch?" Nick asked quietly. "In private, if you please." Harry's stomach clenched. "Is something wrong?" Nearly headless Nick's translucent eyes studied Harry's face with an intensity that made him squirm. "That," the ghost said softly, "is precisely what I hope to determine." The rest of lunch passed in a haze of anxiety. Harry barely heard Ron's commentary on the afternoon's Quidditch practice, or Hermione's detailed explanation of the homework they needed to complete. All he could think about was nearly headless Nick's grave expression, the way the ghost had looked at him, as if he could see straight through to Harry's soul. When the meal finally ended, and students began filtering out of the great hall, Harry lingered until the crowd thinned, then followed nearly headless Nick through a side door and into a small alcove behind a tapestry of dancing unicorns. "You're carrying something heavy," Nick said, without preamble. "Something that's weighing on your spirit as much as your shoulders." Harry's hand moved instinctively to where the ledger was hidden beneath his robes. "I don't know what you mean." "I've been dead for 500 years, Mr. Potter," Nick said gently. "I've learned to recognize the look of someone burdened by terrible knowledge. The living aren't the only ones who keep secrets, you know. The dead see things. We remember things, and sometimes we wonder if we should have spoken up sooner." "What kind of things?" Harry whispered. Nearly headless Nick was quiet for a long moment, his form flickering slightly, as if he were struggling with some internal conflict. "I've watched this castle for centuries," he said finally. "I've seen many headmasters come and go, witnessed countless small tragedies and great triumphs, but I've never seen a child carry himself the way you've been carrying yourself today. Sir Nick, ghosts see things differently than the living," Nick continued. "We're not blinded by charm or reputation or the simple human need to believe the best of those in authority. We see patterns. We see the weight of secrets." Harry's throat felt tight. "And what do you see when you look at me?" "I see a boy who's discovered something that's changed everything he thought he knew about the world," Nick said softly. "And I see someone who's planning to do something very dangerous about it." The truth hung in the air between them, heavy as stone. Harry wanted to deny it, to laugh and claim he didn't know what Nick was talking about. But those pale, ancient eyes saw too much. "Whatever you're planning," Nick said quietly, "be very careful. The truth is a powerful thing, but it's also a dangerous one. And once you speak it aloud, you can never take it back." Harry nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "But," Nick added, his voice growing firmer, "sometimes the most dangerous thing of all is staying silent." With that, the ghost drifted away, leaving Harry alone in the alcove with his racing heart and the weight of the ledger against his ribs. The truth was a powerful thing, and tonight, at dinner, he was going to unleash it on the world. Chapter 4. Ron's Questions and Hermione's Logic. "Harry, mate, you've barely touched your food all day." Ron's voice cut through the comfortable chatter of the common room, where most of the Gryffindor second years were sprawled around the fire completing homework or playing wizarding chess. Harry looked down at the untouched apple he'd been holding for the past 10 minutes, its skin already beginning to brown where his thumb had pressed against it. "I'm not hungry," Harry said automatically, the same response he'd given at lunch, at dinner, whenever anyone had asked. It was becoming his standard answer to everything. "You said that yesterday too," Ron persisted, abandoning his charms essay to give Harry his full attention. "And you picked at breakfast this morning. Are you worried about the Chamber of Secrets thing? Because honestly, it's probably just some Slytherin prank. You know how they get around Halloween." The Chamber of Secrets. Harry had almost forgotten about Mrs. Norris being found petrified last night, about the message scrawled on the wall in what looked like blood. It seemed like a lifetime ago, that moment of discovering the caretaker's cat frozen in the corridor. Everything before the Goblin ledger felt distant now, like memories from someone else's life. "It's not that," Harry said, which was technically true. He wasn't worried about the Chamber of Secrets. He was too consumed with Dumbledore's crimes to spare mental energy for mysterious monsters. "Then what is it?" Ron asked, his freckled face creased with genuine concern. "You've been acting weird all day." Hermione noticed it too. As if summoned by her name, Hermione looked up from where she'd been helping Neville with his potions essay. Her brown eyes were sharp with observation, the same look she got when she was working through a particularly complex problem. "Harry's been distracted in every class today," she said, moving over to join them by the fire. "In Transfiguration, you didn't answer Professor McGonagall's question. In Potions, your solution was completely wrong. And in History of Magic—" She paused, studying his face. "Well, nobody pays attention in History of Magic, but you usually at least pretend to take notes." Harry felt trapped. His two best friends were watching him with matching expressions of concern, and he could see they weren't going to let this drop. Ron and Hermione might bicker constantly, but when it came to Harry's welfare, they presented a united front. "I'm fine," he said weakly. "Just tired." "You're not fine," Hermione said, with the same certainty she used when correcting someone's spell pronunciation. "Something's bothering you. Something big. You can tell us, you know. We're your friends." The word friends hit Harry like a physical blow. They were his friends, his best friends, his first real friends, the people who'd stood by him through a basilisk and a three-headed dog and a madman trying to steal the Philosopher's Stone. They deserved his trust. But they also trusted Dumbledore completely. Absolutely. Ron had grown up hearing stories about the great Albus Dumbledore, the wizard who'd defeated Grindelwald, the man who'd given the Weasley family a place of honor in the wizarding world. And Hermione practically worshipped authority figures, especially ones with impressive educational credentials and long lists of accomplishments. If Harry told them about the ledger, about the theft, about the payments to the Dursleys, they would react with shock and disbelief. They'd insist there must be some mistake, some reasonable explanation. They'd want to go to McGonagall, or worse, they'd want to confront Dumbledore directly and ask him to explain himself. And then Dumbledore would know. He'd have time to prepare, time to craft a response that would make Harry look like a confused, attention-seeking child. Time to make the evidence disappear. Harry couldn't risk that. He couldn't risk losing the one chance he had to expose the truth. "Really?" he said, forcing a smile that felt like broken glass. "I'm just worried about the charms essay. Professor Flitwick said it was due tomorrow, and I haven't even started." Hermione's expression softened with sympathy. "Oh, Harry, you should have said something earlier. I can help you with it. The key is understanding the theoretical framework behind the cheering charm, before you attempt the practical application." "Thanks," Harry said, hating himself for the lie. "That would be great." Ron still looked skeptical, but he let the matter drop in favor of complaining about Snape's impossible potions assignment. Harry half listened to his friend's familiar grumbling, but his mind was elsewhere. In a few hours, when dinner was over and the common room had settled into its usual evening routine, he would have to decide. Tell them the truth and risk everything, or carry this burden alone. The next afternoon brought Defense Against the Dark Arts with Professor Lockhart, which Harry normally approached with a mixture of dread and embarrassment. Today, though, he found himself studying Lockhart with new eyes as the professor preened at the front of the classroom, his perfect teeth gleaming in the candlelight. "As I was saying," Lockhart continued, straightening his peacock-blue robes with obvious satisfaction, "integrity is perhaps the most important quality a wizard can possess. Without it, we become no better than the dark creatures we fight against." Several girls in the front row sighed dreamily. Lockhart's smile widened. "Throughout my career," he went on, gesturing grandly, "I've always made it my policy to be completely honest about my accomplishments. Transparency, you see, is the hallmark of a truly great wizard. When I defeated the Bandon Banshee, for instance, I could have exaggerated my role in the victory. Instead, I told the story exactly as it happened, with myself as the humble hero who simply did what needed to be done." Harry felt a bitter laugh building in his chest. Here was Lockhart, a man whose entire career was built on lies and stolen valor, lecturing about integrity. And sitting in the front row, Hermione was taking notes with the same reverence she'd once reserved for actual competent teachers. "The point is," Lockhart said, his eyes twinkling with what he clearly thought was wisdom, "a man's reputation is only as good as his word. Trust, once lost, can never be fully regained. That's why I've built my entire life around absolute honesty." The irony was so thick Harry could taste it. Lockhart was a fraud, but he was a harmless fraud. His lies hurt no one but himself, and eventually everyone would see through them. But Dumbledore's lies had shaped Harry's entire existence, had stolen his childhood, his inheritance, his right to choose his own path. "Mr. Potter," Lockhart's voice suddenly focused on him. "You look thoughtful. Perhaps you'd like to share your thoughts on the importance of integrity with the class?" Harry looked up to find every pair of eyes in the classroom focused on him. For a moment, he was tempted to stand up and tell them exactly what he thought about integrity, about trust, about the lies that the adults in their lives told them every day. Instead, he said, "I think integrity means telling the truth, even when it's difficult, even when it hurts people you care about." "Excellent," Lockhart beamed. "Absolutely excellent. You see, class, Mr. Potter understands that sometimes the truth can be painful, but it's our duty as wizards to—" The rest of Lockhart's lecture faded into background noise as Harry stared out the window at the darkening sky. Tonight. It had to be tonight. He'd spent the entire day watching his friends worry about him, watching his teachers defer to Dumbledore's supposed wisdom, watching everyone around him live in blissful ignorance of the truth. He couldn't stand it anymore. When class ended, Harry gathered his books slowly, letting the other students file out ahead of him. Ron and Hermione waited by the door, still watching him with concern. "Harry," Hermione said, as they walked toward the great hall for dinner, "I know you said you're fine, but you really don't seem fine. If something's wrong, we want to help." "We're your mates," Ron added. "Whatever it is, we can figure it out together. That's what we do, right?" Harry stopped walking. His friend stopped too, turning to face him in the corridor. They looked so young, so trusting, so certain that the world made sense and that the adults in charge were worthy of their faith. He almost told them. The words were right there, burning in his throat. "Dumbledore has been stealing from me for 11 years. He paid the Dursleys to abuse me. Everything we think we know about him is a lie. But then he imagined their reactions. Ron's instant denial. "That's mental, Harry. Dumbledore would never." Hermione's logical objections. "There must be some mistake. Perhaps we should ask Professor McGonagall." Their inevitable insistence on doing the right thing, which would be to approach the situation through proper channels to give Dumbledore a chance to explain himself. They would ruin everything, not out of malice, but out of love for him and faith in the system they'd grown up believing in. "I'm fine," Harry said one more time. "Really. Just tired and worried about homework." He could see they didn't believe him, could see the hurt in their eyes at being shut out. But he couldn't help that now. Tonight, he would tell the truth. Tonight, everyone would know what Dumbledore really was. And after that, he'd deal with the consequences, including the possibility that his best friends might never forgive him for not trusting them enough to share this burden. As they entered the great hall for dinner, Harry's hand moved instinctively to where the ledger was hidden beneath his robes. The weight of it seemed to have doubled over the course of the day, pressing against his ribs like a second heartbeat. Soon, he thought, very soon, everyone would understand why he'd had to carry this alone. Chapter 5. The Goblin's Gift. Harry was pretending to work on his charms essay when the second owl arrived. The common room had settled into its familiar evening rhythm. Students clustered around tables with their homework, the occasional groan of frustration over a particularly difficult transfiguration problem, the gentle crackling of the fire, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Harry sat in his usual chair by the window, his essay on the theoretical applications of the cheering charm spread before him, but his mind was elsewhere. In 2 hours, maybe 3, the common room would be empty. Students would drift off to their dormitories, the fire would burn low, and Harry would be left alone with his decision. He'd been running through the plan in his mind all evening. Stand up during breakfast tomorrow, pull out the ledger, and read Dumbledore's crimes aloud for everyone to hear. Simple. Terrifying. Irreversible. The tapping at the window was so soft he almost missed it over the ambient noise of the common room. But something made him look up, and there it was. Another Gringotts owl, its amber eyes gleaming in the firelight, a package tied to its leg with the same official seals as this morning's delivery. Harry's heart began to pound. He glanced around the common room, but no one else seemed to have noticed the owl. Ron was absorbed in a wizard chess match with Dean, and Hermione was helping a first year with her potions homework. Carefully, Harry opened the window and allowed the owl inside. This time, the bird didn't simply drop its burden and leave. It perched on the windowsill, watching Harry with an intelligence that seemed almost human as he untied the package. Inside the envelope was another formal note written in Griplash's precise script. Mr. Potter, if you choose to act on the information provided this morning, the enclosed documents will substantiate your claims beyond any reasonable doubt. Goblin records are considered unimpeachable evidence under wizarding law. We have taken the liberty of preparing copies of all relevant documentation, witness statements, and legal precedents. Should you decide to pursue formal justice, Gringotts Bank will provide full testimony and evidence to any properly constituted magical court. The choice, as always, belongs to the wronged party. We await your decision. In service to truth, Griplash, Senior Account Security Investigator, Gringotts Wizarding Bank. Harry's hands trembled slightly as he opened the thick packet that accompanied the note. Inside were dozens of documents, each one more damning than the last. Photocopies of authorization forms in Dumbledore's handwriting, with the distinctive flourish of his signature on document after document. Authorization for emergency withdrawal. A. Dumbledore, acting under emergency guardianship provisions. Authorization for liquidation of non-essential assets. A. Dumbledore, Chief Warlock. Authorization for monthly payments to designated guardians. A. Dumbledore. Emergency guardianship provisions. Harry stared at that phrase until the words lost all meaning. There had been no emergency that required liquidating his mother's jewelry. There had been no crisis that necessitated stealing thousands of galleons from his inheritance. Dumbledore had simply helped himself to whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted it. The witness statements were even worse. Statement after statement from Goblin Bank officials, all describing the same pattern. Dumbledore arriving at the bank with official-looking documents, demanding access to the Potter Vault, growing angry when questioned about his authority. One goblin named Gornook had written, "Subject became hostile when questioned about minor's consent, stated that the boy's welfare superseded normal banking protocols. When reminded that the account holder was a toddler incapable of giving consent, subject replied that he was acting in loco parentis and that his decisions were for the greater good." For the greater good. Harry had heard Dumbledore use that phrase before, usually when explaining why Harry couldn't do something he wanted to do, couldn't know something he wanted to know. Apparently, the greater good was Dumbledore's justification for everything, including theft. But it was the final document that made Harry's vision blur with rage. Legal opinion. Gringotts Department of Magical Lore. Unauthorized access to Potter Family Trust. Under Goblin banking law, the actions described constitute theft of clan inheritance, a crime traditionally punishable by lifetime expulsion from all Goblin-operated institutions and forfeiture of personal assets equal to the amount stolen. Under Wizarding law, the unauthorized liquidation of a minor's trust fund constitutes fraud, theft, and conspiracy to defraud. Additionally, the falsification of authorization documents represents forgery, a felony under the Statute of Magical Crimes, 1692. The total value of stolen assets, including accumulated interest and market appreciation of liquidated items, currently totals 73,492 galleons. 73,000 galleons. The number was so large, Harry couldn't properly comprehend it. That was more money than most wizarding families saw in a lifetime. Dumbledore had stolen enough from Harry to buy a small manor house, or fund a dozen students through Hogwarts, or... The possibilities were endless, and they were all gone. Stolen by a man who preached about love and sacrifice, while systematically looting an orphan's inheritance. Harry. Harry looked up to find Hermione standing beside his chair, her face creased with concern. He realized he'd been staring at the legal opinion for several minutes without moving. "You look pale," she said quietly. "Are you feeling all right?" "Fine," Harry said automatically, hastily gathering the documents and stuffing them into his bag alongside the original ledger. "Just tired." Hermione's eyes narrowed slightly as she took in his flustered movements, the way he clutched his bag protectively against his chest. "Harry, what were you reading? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Nothing important," Harry lied. "Just homework." He could see she didn't believe him, could see the hurt in her eyes at being shut out again. But he couldn't risk it. Not now, when he was so close to having everything he needed. "If you say so," Hermione said softly. "But Harry, if something's wrong, really wrong, you know you can trust us, right?" The word trust hit him like a slap. Trust. What a concept. Harry had trusted Dumbledore for 2 years, had believed every word the man said about protection and safety and love, and all the while, Dumbledore had been systematically stealing from him. "I know," Harry said, and it wasn't entirely a lie. He did trust Ron and Hermione in their way. He trusted them to be loyal, to be brave, to stand by him when it mattered. But he also trusted them to believe in the system, to have faith in authority figures, to insist on doing things the proper way, and the proper way would give Dumbledore time to cover his tracks. After Hermione returned to her homework, and the common room began its slow migration toward bedtime, Harry remained by the window, the Gringotts owl still perched on the sill. The bird seemed content to wait, as if it understood the gravity of the decision Harry was facing. He pulled out Griplash's note and read it again. "We await your decision." The goblins were offering him something he'd never had before. Allies. Powerful allies with their own agenda. Yes, but allies nonetheless. They weren't motivated by love or friendship or misguided attempts to protect him. They were motivated by cold, hard facts and the violation of their banking laws. Harry could appreciate that kind of honesty. He thought about tomorrow morning, about standing up in the great hall while hundreds of students ate their breakfast and trusted their headmaster to guide them safely through their education, about reading the ledger aloud, about watching Dumbledore's carefully constructed image crumble before everyone's eyes. It would destroy people's faith in him. It would shatter their sense of security, their belief that the adults in charge actually had their best interests at heart. It would hurt his friends, who loved Dumbledore almost as much as they loved Harry. But it would also be true. And after 11 years of lies, Harry was tired of living with anything else. He pulled out a piece of parchment and began to write. "Griplash, I've made my decision. Tomorrow morning, I will expose Dumbledore's crimes publicly. I would be grateful for any support Gringotts can provide. Please be prepared to substantiate the evidence if questions arise. Harry Potter." He tied the note to the owl's leg and watched as it launched itself into the night sky, disappearing into the darkness beyond the castle grounds. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, the truth would finally come to light. Harry closed his eyes and tried to prepare himself for the consequences. Chapter 6. Halloween's Truth. The great hall had never felt larger or more intimidating than it did this evening. Harry sat at the Gryffindor table, the Goblin ledger a solid weight against his ribs, where he'd hidden it beneath his school robes, and watched as hundreds of students filled the benches around him. The usual dinner chatter filled the air. Complaints about homework, speculation about weekend plans, nervous whispers about the Chamber of Secrets and what might happen next. None of them knew that in a few minutes Harry was going to shatter their world. "You're not eating again," Ron observed, sliding onto the bench beside him. "Seriously, mate, you're starting to worry me. And Hermione. And probably half the house by now." Harry looked down at his untouched plate. Roast beef, mashed potatoes, green beans, all his favourites, and all completely unappetizing. His stomach was too knotted with nerves to accept food. "I'm fine," he said, for what felt like the 100th time today. "No, you're not," Hermione said, settling across from them with her own dinner. "You've been acting strange all day, stranger than usual, even for you, and that's saying something." Harry forced a weak smile. "Thanks for the vote of confidence." "I'm serious, Harry." Hermione's brown eyes were sharp with concern. "Whatever's bothering you, keeping it bottled up isn't helping anyone. You look like you're going to be sick." She wasn't wrong. Harry felt like he might vomit at any moment. The magnitude of what he was about to do pressed down on him like a physical weight. In a few minutes, he was going to stand up in front of the entire school and accuse their beloved headmaster of being a thief and a manipulator. There would be no taking it back, no pretending it had all been a misunderstanding. His life, as he knew it, was about to end. "Harry?" He looked up to find nearly headless Nick floating beside the table, his translucent form shimmering in the candlelight. The ghost's expression was grave, almost mournful. "So, Nick," Harry managed. "I wanted to wish you luck," Nick said quietly, his voice pitched so low that only Harry could hear. "Whatever you're planning to do tonight, I hope you find the courage to see it through." Harry's throat felt tight. "How did you?" "Ghosts see many things," Nick said simply. "We see the weight people carry, the burdens they bear. And sometimes we see the moment when someone decides they can't carry it anymore." With that cryptic remark, the ghost drifted away, leaving Harry staring after him with a mixture of gratitude and terror. The high table drew his attention like a magnet. Professor McGonagall sat in her usual seat, elegant in her emerald robes, discussing something earnestly with Professor Flitwick. Professor Snape loomed at the far end like a black thundercloud, picking at his food with obvious distaste. And there, in the center of it all, sat Albus Dumbledore. The headmaster was magnificent tonight, Harry had to admit. His robes were deep purple velvet with silver embroidery that caught the light when he moved. His long silver beard was perfectly groomed, his half-moon spectacles perched just so on his crooked nose. He looked every inch the wise and powerful wizard, the beloved grandfather figure, the man who'd saved them all from Voldemort. He looked exactly like what he was, a masterful performer, playing his greatest role. As if sensing Harry's attention, Dumbledore glanced toward the Gryffindor table. Their eyes met across the Great Hall, and for just a moment, Harry thought he saw something flicker in those twinkling blue depths. Recognition, suspicion, or was it just Harry's imagination, fed by his own guilt and fear? Dumbledore smiled and raised his goblet in a small, almost imperceptible toast. To Harry it felt like mockery. The irony was overwhelming. Here they sat on November 1st, exactly 11 years, and 1 day after Harry's parents had died. Exactly 11 years, and 1 day after Dumbledore had begun his systematic theft of the Potter inheritance. Halloween had been the night that changed everything. The night Harry became an orphan, the night he became famous, the night he became Dumbledore's carefully managed asset. And tonight would be the night he took control of his own story. "Students!" Dumbledore's voice rang out over the Great Hall, warm and commanding as always. The chatter gradually died away as hundreds of faces turned toward the high table. "Before we retire for the evening, I thought we might take a moment to reflect on the events of recent days." Harry's heart began to pound. This was it. This was his moment. "As you all know," Dumbledore continued, his eyes twinkling as they swept across the assembled students, "our beloved castle has been touched by mystery once again. The Chamber of Secrets, that legendary room of fear and wonder, appears to have been opened. Some of you are frightened. Some of you are curious. All of you, I suspect, are wondering what comes next." A murmur ran through the hall. Students shifted nervously, glancing at each other with expressions of worry and excitement in equal measure. "In times like these," Dumbledore said, his voice taking on the sonorous quality he used for his most important pronouncements, "it is essential that we remember who we are and what we stand for. This school, this family we have built together, is founded on trust. Trust in each other, trust in our teachers, trust in the bonds that unite us all. Trust." Harry's hand moved instinctively to where the ledger was hidden. Trust was exactly what this was about. "I have served as your headmaster for many years now," Dumbledore continued, "and in all that time I have tried to guide you, not just in magic, but in life. I have tried to show you that power without principle is meaningless, that knowledge without wisdom is dangerous, and that the greatest magic of all is the choice to do what is right, even when it is difficult." The words hung in the air like a challenge. "Even when it is difficult. Even when it hurts people you care about. Even when it destroys the comfortable illusions that make life bearable." Harry stood up. The motion was so sudden, so unexpected, that a ripple of silence spread outward from the Gryffindor table, like a stone dropped in still water. Ron looked up at him with confusion. Hermione's eyes went wide with alarm. Around him, students turned to stare, wondering what could have prompted Harry Potter to interrupt the headmaster's speech. At the high table, Dumbledore paused mid-sentence, his blue eyes focusing on Harry with what might have been surprise or might have been something else entirely. "Mr. Potter?" Dumbledore's voice was gentle, concerned, grandfatherly. "Is there something you'd like to share with us?" Harry reached into his robes and pulled out the Goblin ledger. His hands were shaking, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "Yes, Professor Dumbledore. There is something I'd like to share." He held up the leather-bound book so that everyone in the Great Hall could see it. "This is a banking ledger from Gringotts. It contains records of every transaction involving the Potter family vault for the past 11 years. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the ghosts seemed to have stopped moving, hanging motionless in the air as if the entire castle was holding its breath. Dumbledore's expression hadn't changed, but something in his eyes had gone very still, very careful. "You just spoke about trust, Professor," Harry continued, his voice carrying clearly in the silent hall. "About doing what's right, even when it's difficult. I think it's time everyone heard about the choices you've been making with my family's money." And with that, Harry opened the ledger to the first page and began to read. The reckoning had begun. Chapter 7. The Ledger Speaks. "Professor Dumbledore," Harry's voice cut through the silence of the great hall like a blade of ice. "You just spoke about doing what's right, about trust. I have something here that I think belongs to you." The leather-bound ledger felt impossibly heavy in Harry's hands as he opened it to the first page. Every eye in the great hall was fixed on him. Hundreds of students, dozens of teachers, ghosts hovering motionless in the air. The only sound was the soft crackle of torches burning in their sconces. At the high table, Dumbledore sat perfectly still. His hands were folded calmly before him, his expression unchanged from its usual benevolent serenity. He might have been listening to a student recite poetry, for all the concern he showed. "This is a banking ledger from Gringotts," Harry announced, his voice carrying clearly in the absolute silence. "It contains records of every transaction involving the Potter family vault since November 1st, 1981. He paused, letting that date sink in. "The day after my parents died." A few students shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. Harry looked down at the first entry and began to read. "November 1st, 1981. Unauthorized withdrawal. 15,000 galleons. Authorization. Forged document bearing Albus Dumbledore's signature. Purpose listed as emergency expenses for miners' care. Witness, Griplash of the First Spear." The words echoed in the cavernous hall like stones dropped into still water. Harry heard a sharp intake of breath from somewhere in the crowd, but when he looked up, every face was frozen in shock. "November 15th, 1981, Harry continued, his voice steady and clear. "Unauthorized withdrawal, 8,000 galleons. December 3rd, 1981, 12,000 galleons. January 18th, 1982, 5,000 galleons." He turned the page. "The withdrawals continue, month after month, year after year. Always unauthorized. Always with forged authorization documents." At the Gryffindor table, Ron's mouth was hanging open. Hermione had gone so pale that her freckles stood out like spots of ink on parchment. Around them, students sat like statues, their dinner forgotten, their eyes fixed on Harry with expressions of dawning horror. Harry flipped to another section of the ledger. "But it wasn't just money," he said. "March 12th, 1983. Liquidation of Lily Potter's jewelry collection. Total value, 4,230 galleons. Items sold include emerald engagement ring, pearl necklace inherited from maternal grandmother, gold charm bracelet." His voice cracked slightly on the last item, but he forced himself to continue. "September 7th, 1984. Liquidation of James Potter's Quidditch memorabilia and trophies. October 20th, 1985. Sale of Potter family library, including rare texts on defensive magic." Someone in the Hufflepuff section made a small, wounded sound. Harry couldn't tell who. "And then," Harry said, turning to what he knew was the most damning section, "there are the monthly payments, beginning August 15th, 1985, and continuing every month since. 300 galleons to Vernon and Petunia Dursley, Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. Purpose listed as guardianship services and accommodation expenses." The silence that followed this revelation was different, deeper, more horrified. Students began to look at each other with expressions of sick understanding. Everyone at Hogwarts knew how Harry had been treated before coming to school. They'd seen his too thin frame, his oversized clothes, his desperate gratitude for the smallest kindnesses. "Guardianship services," Harry repeated, his voice harder now. "That's what Professor Dumbledore called it, when he paid my relatives to keep me in a cupboard under the stairs. When he paid them to make me cook their meals and tend their garden and call me a freak. 300 galleons a month, every month, for 11 years. Nearly 40,000 galleons total. Paid with my own money." Professor McGonagall had gone white as parchment. Her hands were pressed flat against the table, knuckles standing out like bones. Beside her, Professor Flitwick looked as though he might faint. Still, Dumbledore said nothing. He sat in his carved chair, blue eyes fixed on Harry, expression unchanged. He might have been carved from stone. Harry's hands were shaking now, but his voice remained steady. "But perhaps the most interesting document in this ledger is this one." He pulled out the copy of his parents' will that had been included with the Goblin documents. The last will and testament of James and Lily Potter, dated October 15th, 1981. 2 weeks before they died. The parchment crackled as Harry unfolded it. "In the event of our deaths," he read, "we name Sirius Black as legal guardian of our son, Harry James Potter. Should Sirius be unable to serve in this capacity, guardianship shall pass to Frank and Alice Longbottom." Harry's voice rose slightly. Under no circumstances is Harry to be placed with Petunia Dursley or any member of her household. The gasp that went up from the assembled students was audible now. At the Ravenclaw table, a 7th-year girl actually put her hand over her mouth. Near the doors, Professor Sprout was staring at Dumbledore with an expression of dawning horror. "Under no circumstances," Harry repeated. "My parents knew exactly what would happen to me in that house. They took legal steps to prevent it, steps that were ignored." He closed the will carefully and returned to the ledger. The final summary, prepared by the Goblin investigators, reads as follows. Total unauthorized withdrawals, 47,329 galleons. Total value of liquidated assets, 23,750 galleons. Total payments to designated guardians, 39,600 galleons. Administrative fees and accumulated interest, 15,347 galleons. Grand total theft from Potter Family Trust, 126,026 galleons. The number hung in the air like a physical presence. 126,000 galleons. More money than most wizarding families would see in 3 lifetimes. Harry closed the ledger with a soft snap that seemed to echo like thunder in the silent hall. "The Goblin investigators conclude," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast room, "that these actions constitute theft by deception, forgery of authorization documents, illegal liquidation of trust assets, and conspiracy to defraud a minor. Under both Goblin and Wizarding law, these are serious felonies." He looked directly at Dumbledore, who continued to sit motionless at the high table. "You spoke about trust tonight, Professor. About doing what's right, even when it's difficult. For 11 years you've been stealing from me. You ignored my parents' wishes and placed me with people you knew would hurt me. You paid them to hurt me, with my own money." Harry's voice rose now, carrying the weight of 11 years of confusion and pain and carefully maintained gratitude. "You turned me into a charity case, a poor little orphan boy who should be grateful for any scrap of affection. You made me dependent on your approval, your guidance, your protection, and all the while that you were robbing me blind." The great hall had never been quieter. Even the ghosts hung motionless in the air, their ethereal forms completely still. Every student, every teacher, every portrait on the walls seemed frozen in time. Harry stood there in the center of it all, the Goblin ledger clutched in his hands, his chest heaving with the effort of speaking truths that had been buried for more than a decade. And still, Dumbledore said nothing. The headmaster sat in his ornate chair, his hands folded peacefully before him, his expression unchanged. No denial, no explanation, no attempt to justify or defend or explain away what Harry had just revealed. The silence stretched on and on, growing heavier with each passing second. Students barely seemed to be breathing. Teachers stared at their hands, their plates, anywhere but at the high table, where their trusted leader sat mute in the face of accusations that no one could deny. Because the evidence was there, in Harry's hands, stamped with Goblin seals and witnessed by bank officials whose integrity was legendary. The evidence was undeniable, unshakable, absolute. Albus Dumbledore was a thief, and nobody moved, nobody spoke, nobody even seemed to breathe. The truth hung in the air above them all like a sword, and the weight of it was crushing. Chapter 8. The Stillness. After. The silence stretched on and on, thick as velvet curtains, heavy as stone. Harry could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears, could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him, but no one spoke. No one moved. The great hall had become a tableau of frozen figures, each person locked in their own private moment of reckoning with what they had just heard. 1 minute passed, then another. Harry counted the seconds by the rhythm of his own breathing, shallow and quick. The Goblin ledger felt like it weighed 100 pounds in his hands. His legs were beginning to shake from standing for so long, but he couldn't seem to make himself sit down. Not yet. Not while Dumbledore sat there in his carved chair, silent as a tomb, offering no defense, no explanation, no denial. It was Professor McGonagall who finally broke the spell. She rose from her seat at the high table like a woman underwater, moving slowly and deliberately. Her face had gone white as parchment, making the severe lines around her eyes and mouth stand out like ink strokes. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the absolute silence of the great hall, every word carried clearly to the furthest corners. "Albus," the single word cracked like glass. "Please tell me this isn't true." All eyes turned to the headmaster. Dumbledore sat motionless for another long moment, his blue eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost conversational, as if he were commenting on the weather. "I acted in what I believed were Harry's best interests." Not a denial. Not a justification. Not an explanation. Just a simple statement of fact that hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow. Professor McGonagall staggered slightly, one hand reaching out to steady herself against the table. You actually..." She couldn't seem to finish the sentence. Her mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish gasping for air. "You stole from him," she finally managed, and the word "stole" fell into the silence, like a stone into still water. "You stole from a child, from your own student, from someone who trusted you." Dumbledore's expression didn't change. "I did what I thought was necessary." The understated admission seemed to break something in the collective consciousness of the great hall. Students began to stir, shifting in their seats, turning to look at each other with expressions of shock and confusion and dawning horror. The whispers started small, barely audible murmurs that grew gradually louder as more voices joined in. But this wasn't the usual excited chatter that filled the hall during meals. This was different, subdued, traumatized. The sound of hundreds of young people trying to process something that challenged everything they thought they knew about their world. Harry's legs finally gave out. He collapsed onto the Gryffindor bench, heavily, the ledger tumbling from his hands to land open on the table before him. The pages fluttered slightly in the drafts that circulated through the hall, and Harry found himself staring down at the neat Goblin handwriting that had just destroyed his headmaster's reputation. "Harry." He looked up to find Ron staring at him with an expression he'd never seen before. Not anger, exactly. Not betrayal. Something closer to bewilderment, as if Ron was looking at a stranger who happened to be wearing Harry's face. "Why didn't you tell us?" Ron's voice was barely audible. "Why didn't you trust us?" The question hit Harry harder than any accusation could have. He opened his mouth to answer, to explain about the need for secrecy, about the risk of Dumbledore finding out, about the careful calculation that had led him to act alone. But the words wouldn't come. How could he explain that he'd been afraid his best friends would try to stop him? How could he tell them that he'd known they would want to handle this the right way, through proper channels that would have given Dumbledore time to cover his tracks? Harry began, then stopped. The truth was too complicated, too painful, too selfish. "I had to." Hermione was crying. Harry hadn't noticed at first, but tears were streaming down her cheeks, leaving wet tracks that gleamed in the candlelight. She wasn't sobbing or making any sound, just sitting there with her hands folded in her lap, letting the tears fall. "I defended him," she whispered. "When other students said he played favorites, when they questioned his decisions, I always defended him. I said he was the greatest wizard alive. I said he would never." She trailed off, unable to finish. Around them, the reactions varied by house and temperament. At the Hufflepuff table, several younger students were openly weeping. Their house values centered on loyalty and fair treatment. The revelation that their trusted headmaster had been systematically abusing a child under his care struck at the very heart of what they believed in. The Slytherins, by contrast, seemed almost vindicated. Many of them came from old families who had always harbored suspicions about Dumbledore's methods. Whispered conversations were already starting about how their parents had been right all along, how the great Albus Dumbledore had always been too fond of his own power to be trusted completely. The Ravenclaws appeared to be processing the information with typical analytical detachment, but Harry could see the shock beneath their composed expressions. They valued truth above all else, and the revelation that their pursuit of knowledge had been overseen by a man capable of such deception was profoundly unsettling. But it was the Gryffindors who seemed most shattered. Their house had always been Dumbledore's obvious favorite. Harry could see it in the way older students stared at their plates, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Dean Thomas had his head in his hands. Seamus Finnegan was staring at the high table with an expression of complete bewilderment. Neville Longbottom looked like he might be sick. "The Longbottoms," Harry heard someone whisper. His parents' will said the Longbottoms. If Sirius Black couldn't take him, Neville's parents should have been his guardians. Harry looked up to see Neville staring at him with wide, horrified eyes. Of course, Harry's parents had chosen Frank and Alice Longbottom as their second choice for guardians. If Dumbledore had honoured their wishes, Harry might have grown up with Neville, might have been raised by people who understood the wizarding world, and could have protected him from both the Dursleys' abuse and Dumbledore's manipulation. "I'm sorry," Harry said quietly, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was apologizing for the revelation that had shattered everyone's faith, for acting alone, for the simple fact that his parents' decision had implicated Neville's family and Dumbledore's web of deception. Neville just shook his head, too overwhelmed to speak. At the high table, the other professors sat in various states of shock and horror. Professor Sprout was staring at her hands, her usual warm demeanour completely absent. Professor Flitwick looked like he might faint. Even Snape, who had never shown particular fondness for Dumbledore, appeared unsettled by the magnitude of the revelations. Only Dumbledore himself seemed unaffected. He sat in his ornate chair, hands folded peacefully before him, blue eyes gazing out over the assembled students with the same benevolent expression he'd worn for decades, as if nothing had happened, as if his entire reputation hadn't just been destroyed by a 12-year-old boy with a banking ledger. "What happens now?" someone asked. Harry couldn't tell who. The question seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The collective voice of hundreds of people trying to understand how to move forward when everything they'd believed had been revealed as a lie. No one answered. There was no answer to give. The feast food grew cold on the plates before them, forgotten in the face of revelations that made appetite impossible. Students continued their muted conversations, but the normal energy of the great hall was gone, replaced by something heavier and more fragile. Harry closed the ledger carefully and held it against his chest. The weight of it seemed to have doubled since he'd first received it that morning. This morning, it felt like a lifetime ago, but it had been less than 18 hours since his world had been turned upside down by Goblin banking records. Now everyone else's world had been turned upside down too. The thought should have brought him satisfaction or relief or some sense of justice served. Instead, Harry felt only a hollow ache where his certainty used to be. He'd gotten what he wanted. The truth was out. Dumbledore's crimes were exposed. Justice was being served. So why did he feel like he'd lost something irreplaceable? The Great Hall felt different now. Smaller, somehow. And sadder. The magic was still there. The floating candles, the enchanted ceiling, the warm golden light. But it all felt diminished, tarnished by knowledge that couldn't be unknown. Harry looked around at his fellow students, his friends, his housemates, the community he'd thought of as family, and saw his own loss reflected in hundreds of faces. They would never be able to look at their school, their teachers, their world the same way again. And it was his fault, his choice, his truth. The weight of it settled on his shoulders like a cloak made of lead, and Harry wondered if justice was always this heavy, or if the price of truth was always this high. Chapter 9. Fragments of Faith. The morning after truth arrived felt different from any morning Harry had ever experienced at Hogwarts. The castle itself seemed subdued, as if the very stones were processing what had happened in the Great Hall the night before. Students moved through the corridors with unusual quiet, their usual boisterous energy replaced by the careful politeness of people navigating around something fragile and broken. Harry had barely slept. Every time he'd closed his eyes, he'd seen the faces from dinner, McGonagall's devastated expression, Ron's bewildered hurt, Hermione's silent tears. The common room had emptied quickly after the meal, students filing out in unprecedented silence, and Harry had found himself alone by the fire with only the weight of what he'd done for company. Now, as he made his way to the Great Hall for breakfast, he could feel eyes tracking him from every direction. Not the usual mixture of curiosity and admiration he'd grown accustomed to, but something harder to define. Some students looked at him with obvious respect, others with wariness, and a few, particularly among the younger years, with what might have been fear. Harry Potter, the boy who'd destroyed their headmaster's reputation in a single evening. "Mr. Potter." The voice made Harry stop mid-stride. Professor McGonagall stood in the corridor, leading toward Dumbledore's office, her emerald robes immaculate as always, but her face bearing the strain of a sleepless night. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her usually perfect posture seemed slightly wilted. "Professor," Harry said quietly. McGonagall looked around the corridor, noting the students who had slowed their pace to listen. "Walk with me," she said, and it wasn't a request. They moved through the castle in silence until they reached an empty classroom. McGonagall closed the door firmly and turned to face him, her expression unreadable. There had been alternatives. Real alternatives. Families who'd wanted him, who'd offered to take him in, who'd been turned away so that Dumbledore could place him exactly where he wanted him. "I failed you," McGonagall said simply. "I should have questioned his decision. I should have insisted on visiting you, on checking on your welfare. I should have—" She stopped, visibly struggling with emotions Harry had never seen her display. "I'm sorry, Potter. More sorry than I can adequately express." Before Harry could respond, she turned and left, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. The rest of the morning brought a parade of unexpected encounters, each one showing Harry how completely the revelation had shifted the dynamics of the school. Professor Snape cornered him after potions, which had proceeded in unprecedented quiet. Even Snape's usual caustic commentary had been muted, replaced by sharp, assessing glances that Harry couldn't interpret. "Potter," Snape said as the other students filed out, Remain behind." Harry braced himself for the usual litany of criticism, but Snape's first words caught him completely off guard. "I wondered why you never questioned your placement with those people," Snape said quietly, his black eyes intense. "Other students in similar situations, orphans, children from troubled homes, they ask questions. They seek alternatives. You never did." Harry began, but Snape held up a hand. "Now I understand. You didn't know to question it. You were told it was necessary for your protection, for your own good. You were grateful." The last word was delivered with particular venom, but Harry sensed the anger wasn't directed at him. The perfect victim, trained to accept whatever scraps of affection were offered. The assessment was brutal in its accuracy, and Harry felt his cheeks burn with shame and anger in equal measure. "Your father," Snape continued, "for all his many faults, would never have tolerated what was done to you. He would have torn down the ministry itself before allowing his son to be treated as disposable." It was perhaps the first genuinely complimentary thing Snape had ever said about James Potter, and it hit Harry harder than any criticism could have. "Why are you telling me this?" Harry asked. Snape was quiet for a long moment. "Because some truths are worth telling," he said finally, "even when they come too late to matter." The library, when Harry found it during his lunch period, was unusually crowded. Students clustered around tables with books on magical law, governance, and historical precedents spread before them. Everyone was trying to understand what Harry's revelations meant, what would happen next, how the wizarding world would respond. At the center of it all sat Hermione, surrounded by towers of books that nearly obscured her from view. She'd obviously been there all night. Her usually perfect hair was disheveled, her robes wrinkled, and there were ink stains on her fingers from frantic note-taking. "Hermione," Harry said softly, approaching her table. She looked up, and Harry was shocked by what he saw. Her eyes were red-rimmed and exhausted, but more than that, she looked lost in a way he'd never seen before. Hermione Granger, who always had the answers, who trusted in rules and authority and proper procedures, had had the foundation of her worldview shattered. "I've been researching," she said without greeting, gesturing to the books around her. "Magical legal precedents for charges against sitting officials, historical cases of institutional fraud, procedures for removing someone from high office when they've violated their trust." "Hermione, did you know," she interrupted, "that there's actually very little legal framework for what you've exposed? The wizarding world assumes that people in positions of authority will act with integrity. There are laws against theft and fraud, obviously, but the idea that the chief warlock of the Wizengamot himself might be the perpetrator." She gestured helplessly at her notes. "The system isn't designed to handle it." Harry sank into the chair across from her. "You didn't sleep at all, did you?" Hermione shook her head. "How could I? Harry, I've spent 2 years defending him. Every time someone criticized his decisions or questioned his methods, I argued that he was too wise, too good, too dedicated to ever act against a student's interests, and all the while—" She trailed off, staring at her books, as if they might contain answers to questions she'd never thought to ask. "I'm sorry," Harry said quietly. "I know this is hard." "Are you?" Hermione asked, and there was an edge to her voice he'd never heard before. "Sorry, I mean, because you don't seem surprised that I'm struggling with this. You don't seem surprised that Ron's been sick to his stomach since last night. You calculated all of this, didn't you? You knew exactly what would happen when you stood up and read that ledger." The accusation hung between them like a blade. Harry wanted to deny it, to claim that he'd been acting purely on impulse, but the truth was more complicated than that. "I knew it would be hard," he admitted. "But Hermione, if I'd told you beforehand, what would you have done?" She was quiet for a long moment, and when she answered, her voice was small. "I would have tried to talk you out of it. I would have insisted we go to Professor McGonagall first, or find some other way to handle it quietly. I would have... She stopped, the implications hitting her. I would have protected him, wouldn't I? Even knowing what he'd done, I would have tried to find a way to minimize the damage to his reputation. Harry nodded. That's why I couldn't tell you, either of you, because you still believed in the system. You still trusted that adults in authority would do the right thing if they just understood the situation. And you didn't? How could I? Harry asked. The system is what put me with the Dursleys in the first place. The system is what allowed Dumbledore to steal from me for 11 years without anyone noticing or caring. The system failed me before I was old enough to understand what a system was. They sat in silence for a while, surrounded by books that contained laws and procedures designed by people who'd never imagined they might need protection from their protectors. Across the library, Harry noticed clusters of students engaged in intense, whispered conversations. The Slytherins in particular seemed energized by the night's revelations. He caught snippets of their discussions as they passed. Father always said Dumbledore was too fond of his own power. Mother warned me that he played favorites. The old families have never trusted him completely. It was the Gryffindors who seemed most shaken. Their house had always been Dumbledore's obvious preference, and many of them had grown up on stories of his heroism and wisdom. To learn that their hero was capable of such calculated cruelty toward one of their own had shattered something fundamental in their understanding of the world. Ron was among the most affected. When Harry finally found him that evening, sitting alone by the lake and throwing stones into the water with violent intensity, his best friend looked like he'd aged years overnight. My dad thinks Dumbledore walks on water, Ron said without looking up. Always has. Says Dumbledore saved the wizarding world from Grindelwald, saved it again from you-know-who. Says we owe him everything. Harry sat down beside him, saying nothing. How am I supposed to go home for Christmas and tell my family that their hero has been robbing and abusing my best friend? Ron's voice cracked slightly. How am I supposed to explain that everything they believe about him is a lie? I don't know, Harry said honestly. Ron threw another stone, harder this time. Why didn't you trust me? He asked, and the pain in his voice was unmistakable. I know why you didn't tell Hermione. She would have wanted to handle it properly. But me? I would have helped you. I would have stood beside you up there. And then what? Harry asked gently. When your family found out you'd helped destroy Dumbledore's reputation? When the entire wizarding world turned against us? You would have lost everything, Ron. Your family's respect, their trust, your place in the community. I couldn't ask you to sacrifice that. That should have been my choice to make, Ron said quietly. Harry had no answer for that, because Ron was right. It should have been his choice, just as it should have been Hermione's choice, and McGonagall's choice, and the choice of everyone else who deserved to know the truth before Harry decided to detonate it in the middle of the Great Hall. But Harry had been thinking like someone who'd spent 11 years learning that adults couldn't be trusted, that systems failed, that the only person he could rely on was himself. He'd been thinking like someone who'd grown up knowing that survival meant keeping your own counsel and acting decisively when opportunities arose. He'd been thinking like a victim. And now, sitting by the lake with his best friend's pain and his own isolation for company, Harry wondered if that was something he'd ever truly be able to change. The day ended as quietly as it had begun, with students filing off to bed in subdued groups, their conversations muted and their usual energy dampened by the weight of knowledge they were still learning to carry. Harry lay in his dormitory bed, listening to his roommate's careful attempts at normal conversation, and realized that this was what victory felt like when you won it alone. Empty. Hollow. Heavy as stone. Chapter 10. The Goblin's Return. 3 days after Harry had shattered Dumbledore's reputation in the Great Hall, the goblins came to Hogwarts. They arrived without fanfare at precisely 9 o'clock in the morning, during the breakfast rush, when the Great Hall was full of students mechanically eating their way through porridge and toast, while trying to pretend their world hadn't fundamentally shifted. Harry noticed them first, a delegation of 6 goblins in formal banking robes, led by the familiar figure of Griplash, moving through the entrance with the purposeful stride of beings who had important business to conduct. The conversations around the hall died away gradually, as students became aware of the unusual visitors. Goblins rarely came to Hogwarts, and never in formal delegations. These weren't here for a friendly visit. Professor McGonagall rose from the high table, her expression carefully neutral, but her posture tense. She'd been serving as acting headmistress for the past 3 days, ever since Dumbledore had withdrawn to his office and refused to address the school or respond to the growing number of urgent owls from the Ministry, the Board of Governors, and concerned parents. "Griplash of the First Spear," she said formally, as the Goblin delegation approached the high table. "This is unexpected." "Professor McGonagall," Griplash replied, his voice carrying clearly in the silence of the hall. He held up a roll of official parchment, sealed with red wax and bound with black ribbon. "I am here on official business of Gringotts Wizarding Bank and the Goblin Banking Tribunal. We seek Albus Dumbledore to serve these papers." The formal words fell into the silence, like stones into deep water. Harry felt his stomach clench as he realized that what had begun as his personal revelation was now becoming something much larger and more official. "What papers?" McGonagall asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Charges of theft by deception, fraud, forgery of authorization documents, and violation of Goblin banking law," Griplash announced. "The accused is hereby summoned to appear before the Goblin Banking Tribunal within 10 days to answer these charges. Additionally, his authorization to access any Gringotts vault is immediately suspended pending the outcome of these proceedings." A collective gasp went up from the students. This wasn't just about Harry anymore. This was criminal charges. This was the Goblin banking system, one of the most powerful institutions in the wizarding world, formally accusing their headmaster of serious crimes. "Furthermore," Griplash continued, "the Ministry of Magic has been informed of these proceedings and has agreed to cooperate with the investigation. As of this morning, Albus Dumbledore's position as Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot has been temporarily suspended." The implications of this statement rippled through the Great Hall like wildfire. Students turned to each other with expressions of shock and growing understanding. Dumbledore wasn't just facing school discipline or loss of reputation. He was facing actual legal consequences that could destroy him entirely. Professor McGonagall closed her eyes briefly, as if gathering strength. "I will inform Professor Dumbledore of your presence," she said finally. "Please wait here." She walked toward the high table's exit with the careful dignity of someone maintaining composure through sheer force of will. The Goblin delegation arranged themselves in a formal line, their presence a stark reminder that the wizarding world operated by laws and consequences that even the most powerful couldn't escape forever. 20 minutes later, Dumbledore appeared. He walked into the Great Hall as if nothing had changed, his purple robes immaculate, his long silver beard perfectly groomed, his blue eyes twinkling with their usual benevolent warmth. To anyone who didn't know better, he looked exactly like the wise and kindly headmaster he'd always appeared to be. But Harry knew better. They all knew better now. "Griplash," Dumbledore said pleasantly, as if greeting an old friend. "How unexpected. To what do I owe this visit?" Griplash stepped forward and handed him the official papers with the ceremony due such moments. "Albus Dumbledore, you are hereby charged with violations of Goblin banking law and are summoned to appear before our tribunal. You will also find therein a formal request from the Ministry for your cooperation in their parallel investigation." Dumbledore accepted the papers with the same serene composure he might have shown when receiving an invitation to tea. He broke the seal and read through the documents with apparent interest, as if reviewing a particularly fascinating academic paper. "I see," he said finally. "How very thorough. And when is this tribunal scheduled to convene?" "Within 10 days, as stated in the summons. You may bring legal representation if you choose. Of course. Dumbledore folded the papers carefully and tucked them into his robes. I assume this means my access to Gringotts services will be temporarily restricted. All vault access privileges have been suspended immediately, Griplash confirmed. Additionally, any assets connected to the charges have been frozen pending resolution of these proceedings. For the first time, Dumbledore's composure seemed to crack slightly. Something flickered behind his blue eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or calculation? Whatever he'd expected from his decades of carefully cultivated relationships with various goblin clans, it apparently hadn't included this level of swift and decisive action. I understand, he said quietly. Professor McGonagall, I believe this situation requires me to step back from my administrative duties until these matters are resolved. Please assume full authority as acting headmistress. With that, he turned and walked from the great hall with the same measured dignity he'd shown upon entering. But Harry noticed that his steps seemed heavier somehow, as if the weight of consequences had finally begun to settle on his shoulders. After Dumbledore's departure, the Goblin delegation remained for another hour, conducting what Griplash termed ancillary investigations. They interviewed several professors, reviewed school financial records, and took detailed statements about Hogwarts' administrative procedures. The message was clear. They were being thorough. Nothing would be overlooked. As the morning progressed, Harry found himself summoned to a private meeting in McGonagall's office, formerly Dumbledore's office, though she'd already removed most of his personal items and replaced them with her own more practical furnishings. Griplash was waiting for him, along with another goblin he didn't recognize, an elderly female with intricate braids in her iron-grey hair and robes that suggested high rank within the banking hierarchy. Mr. Potter, Griplash said formally, allow me to introduce Gornook the Sharp-Eyed, Senior Director of Inheritance Disputes. We have several matters to discuss with you. Harry took the seat McGonagall indicated, his stomach churning with nerves. The formal atmosphere made him feel very young and very much out of his depth. First, Gornook said, her voice crisp and businesslike, we want to commend your courage in bringing these crimes to light. The Goblin Nation values truth and justice above all else, and your actions have allowed us to address a serious violation of our banking laws. Thank you, Harry said quietly, not sure what else to say. However, she continued, our investigation has revealed that the scope of Albus Dumbledore's crimes extends far beyond your specific case. Over the past 2 decades, he has been systematically accessing the accounts of orphaned magical children, ostensibly to manage their affairs during their minority. Harry's blood went cold. Other students? 17 separate cases, Griplash confirmed grimly. Children who were orphaned during the war years, placed in various forms of care, and whose inheritance accounts were subsequently accessed by Dumbledore using forged authorizations. Not all to the same extent as yours, but the pattern is unmistakable. The revelation hit Harry like a physical blow. He'd thought his case was personal, specific, the result of Dumbledore's particular interest in controlling the boy who lived, but apparently it was just one example of a much larger and more systematic pattern of abuse. Most of these children are now adults, Gornook continued. They've completed their education, begun their careers, started families. Many have no idea that their inheritances were compromised. They simply assumed that their parents had left less than they'd expected, or that administrative costs had consumed much of the estate. They deserve to know, Harry said firmly. Indeed. And thanks to your actions, they will know. The banking tribunal will be conducting a full review of all accounts that may have been compromised, and full restitution will be made where possible. Griplash leaned forward slightly. Which brings us to your situation, Mr. Potter. The total amount stolen from your accounts, including accumulated interest and market appreciation of liquidated assets, now stands at approximately 157,000 galleons. The number was staggering. Harry had thought 126,000 galleons was incomprehensible, but this was even larger. However, Gornuk said, there is another matter to consider. Given the extent of the crimes committed against you, and the clear violation of your parents' explicit wishes regarding your guardianship, the banking tribunal is prepared to support a petition for legal emancipation. Emancipation? Harry repeated. Freedom from adult guardianship, Griplash explained. At 12 years old, you would normally be subject to the authority of your assigned guardians until you reach 17. However, given that those guardians were essentially paid employees of your abuser, and that your placement with them violated your parents' will, the tribunal believes you have grounds to claim independence. The implications were enormous. Legal emancipation would mean Harry could make his own decisions about where to live, how to spend his money, who to trust. He wouldn't be subject to Dumbledore's authority, or the Dursleys, or anyone else's. The decision is entirely yours, Gornuk said carefully. Emancipation brings freedom, but also responsibility. You would be legally considered an adult in matters of finance, residence, and personal autonomy. It's not a choice to make lightly. Harry thought about the past 3 days, the isolation, the weight of carrying truth alone, the consequences of acting without trusting anyone else. Then he thought about the past 11 years of being controlled, manipulated, and positioned like a chess piece on someone else's board. I want to think about it, he said finally. Of course, Griplash said approvingly. Take all the time you need. The tribunal will support whatever decision you make. As the goblins prepared to leave, Gornuk turned back to Harry one final time. One more thing, Mr. Potter. Your actions have set in motion changes that extend far beyond your personal situation. The entire system of orphan care and inheritance management is now under review. Laws will likely be changed, oversight will be improved, safeguards will be put in place to prevent this from happening to other children. Because of what I did? Because you had the courage to speak truth to power when it mattered most, she said simply. That is no small thing. After the goblins left, Harry remained in McGonagall's office, staring out the window at the lake and trying to process everything he'd learned. His personal revelation had become a legal case, which had become a systemic investigation, which might lead to fundamental changes in how the wizarding world protected its most vulnerable children. The weight of unintended consequences was staggering. But as Harry thought about the 17 other orphaned children who'd been systematically robbed, he realized he couldn't regret his decision to act. Some truths were too important to keep hidden, no matter how heavy the burden of revealing them might be. Outside the window, the November sky was grey and promising rain. Harry watched the clouds gather and wondered what other storms his choices had set in motion, and whether he was strong enough to weather them all. Chapter 11. Choosing Sides. The Daily Prophet arrived at Hogwarts on a cold November morning, exactly 1 week after the Goblin delegation's visit, and its headline screamed across the Great Hall like a slap to the face. Boy who lived accuses Dumbledore of theft. Gringotts files. Criminal charges against Hogwarts. Headmaster. Ministry launches. Formal investigation into orphan care. Scandal. Harry stared at the newspaper in Ron's trembling hands, his stomach sinking as he read the sensationalized account of what he'd revealed. The article made it sound like a dramatic confrontation, complete with quotes that had been embellished far beyond what he'd actually said, and speculation about his motives that ranged from noble to sinister. "Listen to this," Hermione said, her voice tight as she read from her own copy. "Sources close to the investigation suggest that Potter may have been manipulated by dark forces seeking to undermine one of the wizarding world's greatest heroes. The timing of these accusations, coming so soon after the opening of the Chamber of Secrets, has raised questions about whether the boy who lived has fallen under the influence of the same evil that once attempted to kill him." The words hit Harry like physical blows. Dark forces, manipulation. The implication that he was either lying or being controlled hung in the air like poison. "That's absolute rubbish," Ron said fiercely, but Harry could hear the uncertainty in his friend's voice. Even Ron, who'd witnessed everything firsthand, was beginning to doubt in the face of such systematic character assassination. The reaction throughout the Great Hall was immediate and divisive. Students clustered around copies of the Prophet, their voices rising in heated debate. Some defended Harry, pointing out that the Goblin banking records were unimpeachable evidence. Others questioned whether a 12-year-old could really understand the complexities of financial management, whether there might be explanations for Dumbledore's actions that Harry was too young to comprehend. "My father says Dumbledore saved the wizarding world from Grindelwald," a fourth-year Hufflepuff was saying to her friends. Maybe he needed the money for something important. Maybe it was all for Harry's own protection. Protection? A seventh-year Ravenclaw shot back. He was paying people to abuse a child. How is that protection? The arguments continued throughout breakfast, growing louder and more heated as more students received their own copies of the Prophet. Harry found himself at the center of a storm he'd never anticipated, with every casual glance and whispered conversation feeling like a judgment on his character and motives. By lunch, the Owl Post had turned into a deluge. Hundreds of letters poured into the Great Hall, far more than Harry had ever received even after his most publicized adventures. The owls kept coming in waves throughout the day, delivering missives that ranged from supportive to accusatory to genuinely threatening. Harry opened them in the privacy of an empty classroom, his hands shaking as he read letter after letter. "Mr. Potter, my family owes everything to Professor Dumbledore. He gave us hope during the darkest days of the war. Your accusations are a betrayal of everything he's done for our world. You should be ashamed. Margaret Clearwater." "Harry, I was orphaned during the war too. After reading about your situation, I've been wondering about my own inheritance. Thank you for having the courage to speak up. Thomas Whitby." To the boy who lived. "You're either a liar or a fool. Dumbledore is the only thing standing between us and the dark wizards who would destroy our way of life. Watch your back." A concerned citizen. The threatening letters were the worst, not because they frightened him, but because they showed him how completely he'd underestimated the political implications of his revelation. This wasn't just about truth and justice anymore. It was about power, influence, and the wizarding world's fundamental beliefs about authority and heroism. The situation deteriorated further when Ministry officials arrived that afternoon. Cornelius Fudge, the Minister of Magic himself, swept into Hogwarts with a contingent of aurors and department heads, his lime-green bowler hat askew, and his face flushed with what Harry suspected was panic rather than anger. The minister was known to be a political creature above all else, and the scandal surrounding Dumbledore put him in an impossible position. Harry watched from the Gryffindor common room window as the ministry delegation made their way up to the castle, their official robes billowing in the November wind. McGonagall met them at the entrance, her expression grim but dignified. "This is really happening," Hermione whispered, pressing close to the window beside him. "The ministry is actually investigating Dumbledore." "Course they are," Ron said, though he sounded more worried than triumphant. "They have to, don't they? I mean, after everything that's come out." Harry nodded, but his stomach was churning with anxiety. Ministry involvement meant this was no longer contained within the walls of Hogwarts. It meant political consequences, public trials, media attention that would make the Prophet's sensationalized coverage look restrained by comparison. The investigation proceeded throughout the afternoon with bureaucratic efficiency that was both reassuring and terrifying. Ministry officials interviewed students, examined financial records, and conducted formal depositions with anyone who had knowledge of Dumbledore's actions. The castle felt like it was under siege, with official-looking wizards and witches moving through the corridors in groups, their conversations conducted in the hushed tones of people dealing with a crisis. Harry was called for his own formal interview just before dinner. He found himself in McGonagall's office, facing a stern-looking witch from the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes, a nervous clerk from the Wizengamot Administration Services, and Minister Fudge himself, "Mr. Potter," Fudge began, his voice carrying the forced joviality that Harry remembered from their previous encounters. "This is a very serious matter you've brought to our attention. Very serious indeed." "Yes, sir," Harry said quietly. "Now, I want you to understand that we're not questioning your honesty," Fudge continued, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But these are very grave accusations against a man who has served our community with distinction for many decades. We need to be absolutely certain that you understand the full implications of what you're claiming." The department witch leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Potter, is it possible that you might have misunderstood some of the documentation you reviewed? Financial records can be complex, and sometimes transactions that appear improper actually have perfectly legitimate explanations." Harry looked at her steadily. "The records showed that Professor Dumbledore forged authorization documents to steal money from my family's vault. They showed that he ignored my parents' will and placed me with people he paid to mistreat me. They showed that he liquidated family heirlooms that belonged to me. I don't think there's any way to misunderstand those facts." The officials exchanged glances. The Wizengamot clerk cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Potter, you should also be aware that some complications have arisen regarding your parents' will." "Complications?" "The will names Sirius Black as your primary guardian," Fudge said carefully. "As you may know, Mr. Black was convicted of betraying your parents to you-know-who, and is currently serving a life sentence in Azkaban for those crimes." Harry's blood went cold. He'd known, intellectually, that Sirius Black was supposed to be a traitor who'd betrayed his parents, but seeing it written in the will had made it feel like another lie, another manipulation. Now, faced with official confirmation, he felt the ground shift beneath his feet once again. "So you see," Fudge continued, "the question of your proper guardianship is quite complex. Your parents' wishes, as stated in their will, would have placed you with a known Death Eater and murderer. Professor Dumbledore may have been acting to protect you from that fate. By placing me with people who locked me in a cupboard and made me cook their meals while they called me a freak?" Harry asked quietly. The question hung in the air unanswered. Finally, the department witch spoke again. "Mr. Potter, we want you to know that the Ministry takes these allegations very seriously. A full investigation will be conducted, and if wrongdoing is found, appropriate action will be taken." After the officials left, Harry remained in McGonagall's office, staring out the window at the darkening sky and trying to process everything he'd learned. The revelation about Sirius Black had shaken him more than he'd expected. If his parents' primary choice for guardian was indeed a traitor and murderer, it cast their judgment, and by extension, the validity of their will, in an entirely different light. But even if his parents had been wrong about Sirius Black, that didn't excuse what Dumbledore had done. It didn't justify the theft, the abuse, the systematic manipulation that had shaped Harry's entire life. As he made his way back to Gryffindor Tower, Harry passed groups of students engaged in heated discussions about his allegations and their implications. The school had fractured along lines he'd never anticipated. Some students, particularly those from families that had suffered during the war, defended Dumbledore as a necessary protector, whose methods might be questionable but whose intentions were pure. Others, especially those from old pure-blood families, who had always harbored suspicions about Dumbledore's accumulation of power, saw the scandal as vindication of their parents' warnings. "My mother always said he was too fond of making decisions for other people," Harry heard a Slytherin girl say to her friends. She said anyone who collected that many titles and positions was bound to abuse them eventually. "Well, my dad says he's the only reason we won the war," a Gryffindor boy shot back. "Says without Dumbledore, you know who would have killed us all." The argument seemed to be happening everywhere, dividing the school into factions that Harry had never seen before. Students who had been friends for years now looked at each other with suspicion and distrust. Their fundamental beliefs about good and evil, authority and rebellion, called into question by Harry's revelations. That night, lying in his dormitory bed and listening to the subdued conversations of his roommates, Harry finally understood the full weight of what he had done. This wasn't just about justice for himself anymore, or even justice for the 17 other orphaned children who had been victimized. This was about the wizarding world's entire understanding of power, authority, and the price of heroism. He'd set in motion forces that would reshape their society in ways he couldn't predict or control. The boy who had once been content to be grateful for whatever scraps of affection were thrown his way had become a catalyst for a political and social crisis that would affect thousands of people. The responsibility was crushing. But as Harry thought about the children who would be protected by better laws, the families who would demand transparency from their leaders, the institutions that would be forced to answer for their failures, he realized he couldn't regret his choice. Some truths were worth telling, even when they brought down heroes, even when they changed everything. Chapter 12. The Weight of Truth. 3 weeks after Harry Potter had stood up in the Great Hall and read Dumbledore's crimes aloud, he found himself sitting in the same abandoned Transfiguration classroom where he'd first processed the Goblin ledger. The November afternoon light filtering through the tall windows was weaker now, carrying the promise of winter, and the castle felt different in ways that went beyond the change of seasons. Everything was different now. The desk before him held a stack of official documents, his emancipation papers, signed and sealed, his inheritance statements showing the full restoration of the Potter family vault, letters from the Wizengamot confirming Dumbledore's removal from all official positions pending his criminal trial. The papers represented a freedom Harry had never imagined possible, but they felt heavier than the original Goblin ledger had. Freedom, Harry had discovered, was a more complicated gift than he'd anticipated. Professor McGonagall, Headmistress McGonagall now, the title officially confirmed just yesterday, had knocked on the classroom door an hour ago, checking on him with the careful concern she'd shown ever since his world had turned upside down. She'd found him there often over the past weeks, sitting alone and processing the magnitude of what had changed. The Wizengamot has confirmed that Professor Dumbledore's trial will begin in January, she'd told him gently. All charges have been formally filed. The evidence is comprehensive. Harry had nodded, unsurprised. The goblins had been thorough in their investigation, uncovering layer upon layer of financial crimes that spanned decades. The 17 other orphaned children whose inheritances had been compromised were all adults now, and most had expressed gratitude for finally understanding why their family legacies had seemed smaller than expected. Some had been angry. A few had been devastated. All deserved to know the truth. And the other matter? Harry had asked quietly. McGonagall's expression had grown even more grave. The Department of Mysteries has completed their review of Professor Dumbledore's personal papers and correspondence. The contingency plans they discovered have been classified at the highest levels, but I can tell you that your decision to act when you did may have prevented far worse than financial theft. The implication hung between them, unspoken but understood. Whatever Dumbledore had been planning for Harry's future, it hadn't been good. The knowledge should have been vindication, proof that Harry's instincts had been right, that acting alone and decisively had been necessary. Instead, it felt like another weight to carry. Now, sitting alone with his documents and his thoughts, Harry pulled out the latest letter from Griplash. It had arrived that morning, bearing news that had left him staring at the parchment for nearly an hour. Mr. Potter, our investigation into Albus Dumbledore's activities has uncovered additional evidence that I believe you should be aware of. Among his personal papers were preliminary plans for what he termed the Potter succession. These documents suggest he was laying groundwork to stage your death within 2 years, allowing him to claim control of your full inheritance as your appointed executor. The plan involved manufactured circumstances that would appear to be the result of your celebrity status and the dangers it brings. A tragic accident during summer holidays, or perhaps a heroic sacrifice during a school crisis, something that would cement your legend while conveniently removing your ability to question his management of your estate. I share this not to cause you additional distress, but to ensure you understand that your decision to expose his crimes when you did likely saved your life. The Potter family vault has been completely restored, including replacement of all liquidated heirlooms with items of equivalent value and historical significance. Your inheritance is now valued at approximately 847,000 galleons, representing the original estate plus accumulated interest and appreciation. You are, in the truest sense, free. In service to justice, Griplash 847,000 galleons. The number was so large it felt abstract, meaningless. Harry had grown up thinking he was a financial burden on the Dursleys, grateful for hand-me-down clothes and irregular meals. The revelation that he was actually wealthier than most wizarding families would ever be was just one more way his understanding of himself had been completely rewritten. But it was the other revelation in Griplash's letter that truly shook him. Dumbledore hadn't just been stealing from him. He'd been planning to kill him. Within 2 years, the boy who'd thought his greatest problem was living up to expectations as the boy who lived had actually been marked for death by the very man who'd created that legend. The classroom door opened quietly, and Harry looked up to see Ron and Hermione entering together. Their friendship, his friendship with both of them, had been one of the casualties of his decision to act alone, but over the past 3 weeks, they'd been slowly finding their way back to each other. It was different now, though. Harry was no longer the slightly hapless friend they'd felt compelled to protect and guide. The legal emancipation had made him an adult in the eyes of magical law, but more than that, the knowledge of what he'd survived and overcome had fundamentally changed how all 3 of them related to each other. "McGonagall said you were here," Ron said quietly, settling into one of the dusty chairs. "Figured you might want some company." "We brought tea," Hermione added, producing a thermos and cups from her bag with the practical efficiency that had always been her trademark. "And biscuits. You've been skipping meals again?" Harry accepted the cup gratefully, warming his hands around it. "Griplash sent another letter," he said simply, holding it out for them to read. He watched their faces change as they processed the contents. Ron going pale, Hermione pressing a hand to her mouth in horror. "He was going to kill you," Hermione whispered. "Actually kill you." "To steal money," Ron added, his voice thick with disgust. "To steal money from a dead 12-year-old. Harry nodded. The stark reality of it still felt surreal, like something from a particularly dark fairy tale rather than his actual life. "Do you regret it?" Hermione asked suddenly. "Everything that's happened since? The scandal? The investigations? The way everyone looks at you now?" It was a question Harry had been asking himself repeatedly over the past weeks. His revelation had destroyed the reputation of a man much of the wizarding world considered a hero. It had fractured Hogwarts along political lines that were still healing. It had thrust him into a spotlight he'd never wanted, and made him responsible for changes that extended far beyond his personal situation. "No," he said finally. "I don't regret it. But I think I understand now why adults make the choices they do, why they try to protect children from certain kinds of knowledge, even when those children have a right to that knowledge. Because it's heavy," Ron said quietly. "Because once you know something, you can't unknow it," Hermione added. "And sometimes knowing changes everything." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, drinking their tea and watching the afternoon light fade outside the windows. It was peaceful in a way that Harry's life rarely was anymore. His legal status might have made him independent, but it had also made him visible to political forces and social pressures he was still learning to navigate. "I've decided to stay," Harry said eventually. "At Hogwarts, I mean. McGonagall asked if I wanted to continue here or pursue private tutoring, given everything that's happened. But I want to stay." "Good," Ron said immediately. "I mean, obviously we want you to stay. But it's good that you're choosing it for yourself, rather than just accepting it because someone else decided for you." Harry smiled at that. It was exactly right. For the first time in his life, he was choosing his path rather than having it chosen for him. The weight of that freedom was enormous, but it was his to carry. "What will you do about summer holidays?" Hermione asked. "You can't go back to the Dursleys." "I won't," Harry said firmly. The Ministry had officially terminated the guardianship arrangement, and Harry's emancipated status meant he could live wherever he chose. "I'm looking at some properties. There's a small house in Godric's Hollow that's available, ironically, not far from where my parents lived. McGonagall thinks it might be good for me to have somewhere that's truly mine." The idea still felt strange, having his own house, making his own decisions about where to live and how to spend his money and who to trust with his secrets. For someone who'd spent 11 years in a cupboard under the stairs, the transition to complete independence was dizzying. "And after Hogwarts?" Ron asked. Harry shrugged. "I don't know yet. I'm 12 years old, even if the law considers me an adult. I figure I have time to work it out." What he didn't say, but what all three of them understood, was that his choices were no longer constrained by other people's plans for his life. Whatever he decided to do with his future, it would be truly his decision. As the afternoon faded into evening, they made their way back to Gryffindor Tower together, passing through corridors that had gradually returned to normal as the school adapted to its new reality. The scandal had shaken Hogwarts to its foundations, but institutions were remarkably resilient. Under McGonagall's steady leadership, the castle was healing. The Chamber of Secrets, which had dominated conversations in the weeks immediately following Halloween, had faded from attention as it became clear that whatever had petrified Mrs. Norris wasn't striking again. Harry suspected, though he couldn't prove it, that Dumbledore's removal had somehow prevented the crisis from escalating. The specifics didn't matter. What mattered was that his classmates were safe, and that future students would be protected by the stronger oversight and accountability measures the scandal had prompted. That night, as Harry lay in his dormitory bed, listening to the familiar sounds of his roommates settling down to sleep, he reflected on how completely his life had changed in just 3 weeks. He was wealthy beyond imagination, legally independent, and free from the manipulations that had shaped his entire existence. He was also lonelier than he'd ever been, burdened with knowledge that set him apart from his peers, and responsible for changes whose full implications he was still learning to understand. But he was free. Truly, completely free. And for the first time in his life, his future belonged entirely to him. Outside his dormitory window, the November night was clear and cold, stars visible above the castle grounds. Harry watched them for a long time before sleep finally claimed him, and his dreams were of paths not yet chosen, and possibilities not yet imagined. Tomorrow would bring new choices, new challenges, new opportunities to shape his own destiny. And Harry Potter, no longer the grateful victim, no longer anyone's pawn, was ready for whatever came next. The weight of truth, he'd learned, was heavy. But it was nothing compared to the weight of freedom. And freedom, whatever its cost, was worth everything.